day two. For our speakers, I hope you had a good time last night, and for everybody else, I hope you also had a good dinner here in Hong Kong. So the first session of day two is going to start. We've got our chair, Yolene Blom. We'll start with an invited in-person talk, and then will be followed by a number of remote talks from our colleagues, mostly based in North America, for whom this is the best time zone where it works for both sides. I'll give it now over to Yolene.
Good morning, everyone. As Leon said, we'll have first one in-person talk, and then we'll have 4 remote talks. So I'm happy to welcome Anthu Cathy NGUYEN to the stage. Take it away, Cathy.
Thank you, Yolene. So also good morning from me. I'm very grateful that you all made it. I'll try to wake you up, but I'm a bit of a theory person, so that includes a French philosopher, so that is probably not ideal to wake up to. I apologize in advance. So I'm a PhD student at the moment at Ritsumeikan University based in Kyoto, Japan. I defended my thesis in January, so this is like a more or less concluded project, but today is like the first time where I am going to try take my PhD thesis to another game that I haven't analyzed in my actual work. So I know this session is called Traveling Beyond Genshin, but I'm more or less staying within Genshin, but I want to challenge these borders between physical and digital travel a little bit. So for this presentation, I want to answer one question together. Why should we think of games through the lens of tourism, or why should we specifically think about Genshin Impact through tourism? And so for the past couple of years, I've been working on my thesis where I put forward, I've worked on a concept that I call Ludic tourism. It's both a conceptual and analytical framework that I use because I'm interested in mobilities. I'm interested in the mobilities that are designed in the games, but also the mobilities of cultures in the way that they become commodified in game spaces. So in my work, I looked at Cyberpunk 2077 and Ghost of Tsushima, and I was particularly interested in how these worlds coordinate movement, cultural signifiers, and the negotiation of space. So I focus on open world games with this limitation in my thesis, and often the entire premise of open world games is it's about adventure, it's about travel, discovery, exploration. It promises you ownership over such places, that this game world is only for you. Genshin Impact, I would argue, is another one of those open world games that fits this paradigm. There are a few small differences that I try to highlight here, but mostly this is going to be based off my thesis. So at this point, it's probably productive to briefly outline what I really mean with tourism, because I think all of us have a very, very specific image or conception of what tourism is. And essential to my work is the concept of the tourist gaze. So this is a term coined by John Urry and Jonas Larsen, and they take on the idea of the medical gaze by Michel Foucault, who says that the way of looking and seeing is never neutral. It's always coined and conditioned by social and cultural factors. As such, Urry and Larsen argue that looking at places and cultures is never neutral. And there are certain expectations and there's anticipation, which is shaped by what they call non-tourist technology. So this is a fancy word, but they basically mean like photographs, commercials, pamphlets, postcards, but also television, literature, and other kinds of media. So as such, tourism is not a specific activity. That can be isolated to a specific thing. So rather, tourism in our media-saturated world, it's fragmented, it's spontaneous, instantaneous, it's mediated, and so playful, if you will. For my purposes in my work, as I approach game space and game design from like a top-down perspective, I'm really interested in how such media commodifies space and culture for the purposes of leisure. So different to the traditional non-tourist technologies that Urry and Larsen outline, I argue that digital games go beyond this. They allow both the imagination of place, but also being in that place, to partake in it. They allow players to participate and interact with such imaginations. Because games structure and coordinate action and looking in their own media-specific way, video games can become touristic experiences in their own right. That is to say that they do not replace physical and real-world tourism, but they can become activities that coordinate a new kind of digital mobility. So to talk about the commodification of space, place, and cultures, I would like to briefly talk about the 1851 Great Exhibition in London's Hyde Park. So this exhibition was supposed to celebrate modern industrial technology and as such featured all kinds of technological exhibitions from around the world. So is the idea. But because the host country was the United Kingdom, the overall aim for the UK was to express their own industrial, imperial, and colonial superiority. What they did beyond exhibiting their own technology was to feature artifacts, often stolen diamonds from the colonies. This too was to underscore the prowess of the United Kingdom. This was less about the representation of what the cultures was of the cultures of their own colonies, rather than a projection of their own power. So the more interesting aspect of the 1851 Great Exhibition is also the structure that we can see here on this lithograph. It's the Crystal Palace. The original version of it is a modular structure made of glass pane structure that could be extended if needed, and through its panes, it suggested, like the ceiling, it suggested a seemingly infinite sky and open sky. It was supposed to underscore the worldly feeling of the Great Exhibition. Keeping in mind these techniques of the Crystal Palace, when we talk about the commodification of space, most will refer, and most tourism scholars will refer to Disneyland as like the perfection of a design space for the purposes of middle-class leisure. Disneyland and Walt Disney put a particular emphasis on telling a story through its space, through a theme. Most famously, he said that even a trash can's design must fit the land that it's situated in. Even today, the lands of Disneyland and other theme parks derive their themes from specific cultural inspirations. Different to the Crystal Palace, however, they often reference media franchises, even though these media franchises, again, often also reference other real-world cultures and places. So the strategic building of themes to make regions distinguishable from one another in Disney, the modular expansion possibilities of the Crystal Palace, the strategies behind building a place for consumption is not all too different to how video game worlds are designed. And some game designers are very explicit about this. In one of my examples for my thesis, I cite the original creator of the cyberpunk tabletop game, who in a podcast said he thought Disneyland was the coolest thing ever, and he wanted to create a cool space. And so he wanted like a Latino area and like an Asian area, whatever that means. Here is a map of Teyvat. This is clearly not a nice map to look at in a way that it would probably kind of suck for orientation. But even looking at this map, there's a clear visual signifier for each region. And for you who've played the game, you know that there's like a Japan area and a China area, if you will. And yesterday we heard a beautiful presentation on food and how certain foods represent certain regions. So this is like a shortcut on how to represent these individual regions. And so my interest here lies not in discerning whether these representations are accurate or authentic. I think this is an analysis that points toward representational strategies, but this is not all that tourism is about. My argument for all the regions in Genshin is that they are slices of different cultures that become distorted, simplified, and made visually consumable for the purposes of commodifying space to create a coherent game experience. So beyond visual, game worlds and how they coordinate such visual markers in an open world like Genshin, they serve as places for exploration, and most importantly, for the touristic experience to come into full force, for players to gain a sense of ownership over this place. So how does this happen? So this is a little bit of the theoretical analysis bit, and I go very deep into this, obviously, in my work, so I'm trying to be very simple. I will just simplify what I do by saying that a game world like Genshin must be attractive for the player to explore, and doing that requires to coordinate looking into concrete action. And what I mean is this. Looking at this screenshot, I'm standing on an elevated vertical position that allows me to look into the landscape. The landscape contains very concrete ludic information. It shows me my primary prospects. So like here, for example. meaning the next points of interest where I can go to in hopes of rewards, maybe new puzzles, challenges. So in that sense, this act of looking fills the player with expectation and anticipation. And because the open world game is technically, well, in a limited sense, infinite, there's the potential for secondary prospects, places that I cannot yet see, but I know that are there once I go somewhere else. Meaning that once I leave the spot and go to the mountain over here, for example, there may be more places that can challenge me, that entertain me, or give me rewards. So the term I use for this kind of like topographical principle is taken from game studies scholar Mark Bonner, who described this kind of loop as prospect pacing, the way topography of an open world game coordinates the drive for exploration. This is part of an open world gameplay loop that a player must master. So Bonner also describes the game world as a world-shaped hull in terms of its ideology, and derives like a lot of the terminology from places like the Great Exhibition, but also British landscape gardens. The idea that open world games take different slices of biomes and weather and nature and put it all together into one enclosed continuum. So this is a point I want to foreground, this kind of rhythmic linking into gazes, into action, prompted by spatial conquest, gives the player a voyeuristic, godlike position. I'm referring to Michel de Soto here, who says that when you go onto a skyscraper in New York, you remove yourself from the chaos of the city, and when you go onto an elevated position, you gain control over the chaos that is New York. It becomes ordered, it becomes structured. So this is one of the practices that I emphasize as part of like the touristic experience or the ludic tourism part of open world games. And some tourism scholars, they define, and it's hard to define tourism, but for some, tourism is, in its most basic sense, the commodification of place. It provides the tourist with a sense of ownership over places simply by visiting and gazing at them. So in this example, you're not just visiting and gazing at these places, but you also kind of incorporate these habits into your play. And for Genshin, in addition, I would also argue that this ownership hinges on its gacha mechanics. Important to understanding prospect pacing is the strategies of movement, and some characters, as I understand it, have different movement toolkits. I know for some it's easier to conquer certain mountains, or it's easier to walk over water, stuff like that. And this plays an essential role in the mastery of space. So in my analysis of the games I look at, I usually look at the paratext to a certain extent, usually the marketing material. I don't want to go into this too deeply because a lot of the collaborations are kind of just like come here and then you get limited merchandise, and it's not really that interesting. But in this case, this was a Japan collaboration where they set up an exhibit at a popular anime merch retail shop in Tokyo and Osaka. And here the promotion reads Tabi Kokoro no Omomoku Mamani, which means something like traveling as your heart desires. Thank you. So this is one of the more obvious cases where a kind of touristic language is utilized to promote the game, but also the event. And they tried to set up these spaces to make them resonate with the players, to the virtual world, so to speak, that seeps into the physical world. And I think that is very interesting in how to make the game world feasible and more real, perhaps, to the player as a place that they can visit in the real world. But I hope the sound doesn't play. So I hope it's not too loud. I'm just going to have this in the background. Perhaps my favorite collab that I stumbled upon for the purposes of this presentation is the collaboration Genshin did with the Discovery Channel. It's really a video about nature, climate, and pollution, but it starts with this quickly cut scenes of the landscape of Teyvat, and then it goes over to these real places of Earth. And the video is about the voices of nature. So it produces this kind of parallelism between the portrait beautiful nature of Teyvat and Earth as something that must be preserved and protected. So this is another interesting way of using the game world to seep into the real world. Yeah. Okay. So to finally go back to my initial question, why should we think about Genshin or games in general as ludic tourism? So a tourism lens asks how places are made meaningful in a sense of leisure practices under capitalism. So I always emphasize, my analysis is usually close reading, but I always emphasize the commodification aspect of these practices, the practices of seeing, moving, and commodifying space. This leads me to my next point about how relevant this part of commodification is, and how world-building strategies use games to communicate something about history and heritage and cultural objects, but at the same time kind of simplify it, because this is just something that is typical in the process of creating such spaces. This lens also highlights how play produces place knowledge, and while play in my work is usually bound to video games, the strategies and the way players learn to orient themselves and anticipate destination and attach meaning to such places is usually not. It usually seeps over to outside of video games. So what I mean with this is that this anticipation is something that is learned and carried over to the real world. Even though my focus is usually how game studios and their marketing attempt to create such touristic experiences, this also includes players. Building expectation and anticipation is embedded into play, and when it takes place in culturally charged and themed spaces, then they can be particularly effective and memorable. So, thank you so much for having me. Would love any questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Katie. Are there any questions? There is a question.
Are these microphones working today? Maybe. Right. Hello.
Hello.
Really interesting talk. I guess my question is, do you think this is like inevitable and inherent to the open world genre, right? Because like, obviously you're talking about these as like standard design strategies of the genre. Is it like even possible to make an open world game, or maybe even just to be provocative, a game that doesn't do this, right? Like, is this like a, yeah.
Yeah, thank you for your question. This is quite important. It allows me to clarify two things. I choose open world games because I think the potential for the touristic experience is the highest. I don't say that other games cannot do it when they don't have an open world game design. So there's always the potential for touristic experiences, but not all games intended the same way. And then now going back to whether open world games are just inherently like that, partly yes, but I'm also talking about kind of like an idealized way of, okay, looking always has to result into action, always has to result into reward. There are some games who are unable to do this, where maybe then the experience becomes distorted or confusing. And for example, Cyberpunk 2077, when it was first released, a lot of things weren't working, glitches, bugs, etc. And that is when usually the act of looking would result into no action or unrewarding action, or rather the gaze would kind of show you that the game was not complete. So it was kind of like a distorted experience, and which is probably why the experience for many people at the time of release was so dissatisfying. So yeah, thank you.
More questions. Okay, we go first over there, then to the middle, then to the back, and I think then we've filled all 4 minutes.
Hello.
Hello. Thank you. That was a brilliant talk. I really enjoyed it. I'm really interested in your PhD research as well. And I also really liked looking at the Great Exhibition as kind of like a sort of like historical example of this kind of world building, we might say. I just wondered, out of curiosity, has any like of Umberto Eco's ideas about hyperreality sort of fed into your PhD research?
It was a Pandora's box I didn't want to open, but I do mention it briefly because hyperrealism is a good way to say that what if these experiences are the same as real-world tourism, or like so good that they might replace real-world tourism. So I would argue that they're not the same. I don't think that video games replace real-world tourism, but not in a sense of like a hierarchical meaning. Like, I don't think that all video games are just worse and they have to kind of like be better or be like more expensive. I don't think that's the case. I think the hyper-real is so real that it becomes its own thing. So that's how I try to argue with video games, because they coordinate very different ways of looking. As an example, usually people, when they hear my PhD, they will bring up Assassin's Creed. I've never played Assassin's Creed, but they'll usually tell me something like, I went to Florence and I looked at these roofs. And roofs are not very interesting, right? But as an Assassin's Creed player, they are very interesting. And they'll often say something like, not, oh, I always wanted to be here, but they'll say something like, I have been here. I know this place. And I think for hyperrealism, this is quite interesting, because this is very different from what people, like, I don't do ethnographic work, but for the few studies that exist on how players negotiate their own experiences, this is a common pattern with video games. Yes, thank you.
There was a question here in the middle.
Hi, good morning. Thank you
Good
for
morning.
your talk. I wanted to ask, so I feel like the broader implication of this is that games take inspiration from real life, obviously, and like languages, cultures, etc. But it seems like there's a broader trend right now of people choosing to go places offline because of a game.
Yeah.
Like I found myself going to, I forgot, was it Tokyo Sky Tower for like Yae merch, which was like
Yes.
really embarrassing. And then
No, it's
so
not.
I was wondering, like, what do you feel like how do you feel like the ethical or like social cultural implications behind like
Yeah.
you know, this reverse kind of consumption
Yeah.
pattern? Yeah.
So
Thank you.
thank you for your question. So in the context of Japan, there has been a decent amount of research on what they call anime pilgrimages or content tourism, referring to the act of traveling to places because it's like associated with anime. I mean, I've done this a couple times. I visited places in Tokyo just because I wanted to see something about Jujutsu Kaisen, or I wanted to see where a character dies in Chainsaw Man. I mean that, and pilgrimages sounds a bit like religious, but sometimes like, people leave flowers at these places, okay, and it really feels like a pilgrimage because it's like very solemn. Sometimes, if it's not like completely commercialized. Content tourism is an interesting way to see how the real world negotiate, or the other world, both real and digital spaces negotiate each other. And Japan is one of the few countries that tries to utilize this in a commercial way. But I do think for anime pilgrimages, it's nice when it's natural and it's free from all these like, come here to get limited merchandise. I don't know if this like completely satisfies your question. We can talk about it more later if you like and interested in it, but I'll just cut for here for now. Thank you.
Thank you. We've indeed have run out of time, so if you have any questions left for Katie, I suggest you do that during the break.
Yes.
One more round of applause for her, please. Thank you.
Thank you.